There was a time in America when the family gathered in one room, turned off the lights, and listened. Not to music, not to news, to stories. A wooden box with a glowing dial sat in the corner of living rooms from Maine to Montana, and at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night, millions of Americans went completely still. They had been waiting for this all day. Some of them had walked 3 miles to a neighbor's house just to hear it. Then, in less than a decade, nearly every one of those shows was gone. Not canceled because they were bad. Gone because the medium that carried them simply ceased to exist. The studios closed. The scripts were thrown away. The recordings were wiped. The performers moved on or retired or died. And an entire world of American storytelling disappeared so completely that most people alive today have never heard a single program from it. These are those 25 shows. Before we get started, hit the subscribe button so you will not miss any of our look-backs at America's glory days. Number 25, Amos and Andy. Amos and Andy began in 1928 on a Chicago radio station with 2 white comedians, Freeman Gosden and Charles Correll, voicing black characters living in Harlem. Within 2 years, it had become the most listened-to program in the history of American broadcasting. 15 million people tuned in every night. Movie theaters interrupted their films to pipe the broadcast through the speakers so audiences would not miss it. Telephone companies reported that evening calls dropped almost to 0 during the broadcast window. Americans loved it because it was funny in a way that felt specific and human rather than generic. The characters had actual lives. They had a taxicab company. They had financial troubles. They argued. They made plans that fell apart. The comedy was not about stupidity, but about the gap between ambition and reality, which is the condition of nearly every working American who has ever existed. The show ran for 32 years in various forms before the NAACP campaign against its racial stereotyping finally ended the television version in 1953. The radio program continued until 1960. By then, the audience had already moved to television, and the medium that had made Amos and Andy the most famous radio program in American history had simply moved on without it. What it left behind was the template for the American sitcom. The ensemble of recurring characters with overlapping relationships. The episodic structure built around a single comic misunderstanding. The warm resolution. Every sitcom made in the 70 years since Amos and Andy ended owes a structural debt to what Gosden and Correll built in a Chicago studio in 1928. Number 24, The Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger rode onto American radio in January 1933 from a Detroit station called WXYZ, and he never stopped riding for the next 21 years. A masked Texas Ranger, the only survivor of an ambush, riding a white horse named Silver alongside his Native American companion Tonto, delivering justice to the frontier West one episode at a time. Children planned their weeks around it. Boys in small Indiana towns, Mississippi cotton fields, and Brooklyn tenement apartments all knew the opening gallop of the William Tell Overture and what it meant. Hi-yo, Silver. Away. The show worked because it gave Depression-era and wartime American children something they desperately needed, the certainty that one good man with enough courage could make things right. The Lone Ranger never killed. He shot the gun out of the villain's hand. He left a silver bullet as his calling card. He never stayed long enough to be thanked. Justice was possible. That was the message. And for children growing up during the worst economic collapse and the largest war in American history, that message was not escapism. It was survival. The radio program ended in 1954 when the television version made it unnecessary. The recordings survived better than most programs of the era because the producers understood they had built something valuable and preserved the acetate discs. What the Lone Ranger left behind was the American hero archetype that still governs action storytelling today. The loner who serves the community without belonging to it. The man who solves the problem and disappears. You can trace a straight line from the WXYZ's studio in 1933 to every Western, every superhero film, every action hero who has ever walked away from the grateful townspeople without looking back. Number 23, Fibber McGee and Molly. Fibber McGee and Molly ran from 1935 to 1959, and at its peak reached 40 million listeners every Tuesday night on NBC. That number is almost impossible to comprehend now. 40 million people in a country of 130 million, nearly 1 in 3 Americans every week listening to a blustering middle-class man named Jim Jordan and his patient, sensible wife Marion living at 79 Wistful Vista in a fictional Midwestern town. The show's most famous running gag was the hall closet. Fibber McGee's closet was crammed with 20 years of junk, and every time he opened it, an avalanche of sound effects buried him in accumulated American clutter. The closet sound became one of the most recognizable audio moments in radio history. People who never heard the show knew what it meant when someone said the hall closet is going to fall on them. Americans loved it because Fibber McGee was a specific kind of American that every American recognized. He was slightly too confident about things he did not actually know. He started projects he did not finish. He told stories that grew in the telling. And Molly loved him anyway, with a patience that was not passive but warm and knowing. She was not a doormat. She was the person in the room who understood what was actually happening and chose not to make a big deal of it. The show ended in 1959, not because it failed, but because the audience had moved. The last broadcast came with almost no ceremony. A program that had been in 40 million American living rooms simply said good night and was not there the following Tuesday. What Fibber McGee and Molly left behind was the domestic comedy tradition, the imperfect husband, the grounded wife, the neighborhood populated with recognizable types. Every domestic sitcom, from I Love Lucy to Everybody Loves Raymond, is working in territory that Fibber McGee and Molly cleared and cultivated over 24 years of Tuesday nights. Number 22, Jack Benny. Jack Benny began on radio in 1932 and ran for 23 years, moving to television in 1950 while continuing on radio until 1955. He was the highest paid entertainer in America for most of that period. His show was the most critically praised comedy program of the radio era. The character he built over those 23 years was one of the most carefully constructed comic personas in the history of American performance. The Jack Benny character was vain, cheap, cowardly, and 39 years old forever. He was the straight man in his own show. The jokes were not what Jack Benny said. The jokes were what happened around Jack Benny while he stood there being exactly who he was. His timing was so precise that his silences became as famous as his lines. There is a sketch in which a mugger demands his money or his life, and Jack Benny pauses so long that the studio audience begins to laugh before he says anything at all. When he finally speaks, he says he is thinking it over. Though pause is studied in comedy schools to this day. Americans loved Jack Benny because he was willing to be the fool. He did not ask to be liked. He asked to be seen clearly and laughed at honestly. That is a rare and generous thing in a performer. His show was built on the assumption that the audience was intelligent enough to understand a joke that relied entirely on character rather than situation. The radio program ended in 1955. Jack Benny continued on television until 1965. When he died in 1974, every major performer in America sent condolences. Bob Hope said that Jack Benny was the best audience a comedian ever had. He meant that Benny understood comedy well enough to know when to stay out of the way of it. What Jack Benny left behind was the standard for comic character construction, the idea that a performer could build a single persona over decades, and that consistency was itself the joke. Every character comedian who has ever built a running gag owes a structural debt to the 39-year-old miser at 79 Roxbury Drive who thought it over for 4 seconds before answering the mugger. Number 21, The Shadow. Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. That opening line ran from 1937 to 1954, and it gave an entire generation of American children the most satisfying shiver they had ever felt from a radio speaker. The Shadow was Lamont Cranston, a wealthy man about town who had learned in the Orient the ability to cloud men's minds so they could not see him. He was essentially invisible. He fought crime, and his laugh was the most recognizable sound in American radio. The laugh was created by actor Frank Reddick in the early years of the program, before Orson Welles took over the lead role in 1937. Welles was a genius, but he could never quite master Reddick's strange, sibilant laugh, so recordings of Reddick's original performance were used at the opening of every episode throughout Welles's run. The voice millions of Americans came to associate with The Shadow was actually two different men, and nobody knew the difference. Americans loved The Shadow because it was genuinely frightening in a way that felt safe. The evil was real. The violence was implied. The Shadow did not pull punches. People died in these stories, but Lamont Cranston was always there, invisible and relentless, and the evil was always punished. That combination of real danger and guaranteed justice is exactly what an audience wants from a thriller. The danger makes the resolution feel earned. The Shadow left radio in 1954. The recordings were considered low culture and were not preserved with any care. Many of the early episodes survived only because collectors made bootleg recordings on home equipment. The official archives were largely destroyed or lost. What The Shadow left behind was the template for the American superhero: the secret identity, the special ability, the rogues gallery of villains, the city as a place of moral darkness waiting for someone to push back against it. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were listening to The Shadow when they were boys in New York. You can hear it in everything they made. Number 20, Inner Sanctum Mysteries. Inner Sanctum Mysteries ran from 1941 to 1952, and it opened every episode with the sound of a creaking door. Just a door, opening slowly, and somehow that single sound effect, played at the start of more than 500 episodes, became one of the most recognizable sounds in American radio history. People heard a creaking door and thought of murder. The host was a character called Raymond, who made punning jokes about death before each story began. He welcomed listeners into the inner sanctum. He warned them that what they were about to hear might disturb them. He delivered that warning in a voice that made it perfectly clear. He was delighted about it. The stories were genuinely dark by the standards of the time. Poisonings, strangulations, psychological horror. The violence was never explicit because radio cannot show blood, but it could make you feel it through sound design and suggestion. the squeak of a floorboard, a chair scraping, silence where there should have been breathing. Americans loved Inner Sanctum because it gave them controlled fear, the same reason people have always loved horror. You choose to be scared. You can turn the radio off. The power is yours. But you never turn it off because the story is better than the fear is uncomfortable. And Raymond's puns at the end reassure you that even death can be made to seem slightly ridiculous. The show ended in 1952 when the sponsor, Lipton Tea, moved its advertising budget to television. One of the most frightening programs in American radio history was canceled because a tea company decided television was a better place to sell tea. Raymond signed off for the last time and closed the creaking door behind him. What Inner Sanctum left behind was the horror host, the sardonic presenter who welcomes you into the darkness with a smile. Every horror anthology television program, every late-night creature feature host, every podcast narrator who opens with a disclaimer about disturbing content is working in the tradition that Raymond established in that creaking doorway in 1941. Number 19, Suspense. Suspense ran from 1942 to 1962 and was produced by CBS with a deliberate commitment to quality that was unusual for radio drama. The best writers in Hollywood submitted scripts. The best actors performed them. Cary Grant, Humphrey Bogart, Orson Welles, Agnes Moorehead, James Stewart, and Lucille Ball all appeared on Suspense, not because they were paid enormous sums, but because the program had a reputation for doing something genuinely interesting with the thriller format. The show's producer, William Spear, established a specific principle early on. The audience would know what was going to happen before the characters did. You would watch someone walk into a trap they could not see. The tension was not in the surprise. The tension was in the waiting. Suspense did not hide the danger from you. It showed you the danger and then made you watch helplessly as the character walked toward it. Americans loved Suspense because it respected their intelligence. Most popular entertainment of the era underestimated its audience. Suspense assumed you could handle knowing the outcome, and that the real pleasure was in watching the craft of how it was delivered. Alfred Hitchcock worked on the same principle in his films, and it is not a coincidence that Hitchcock's most successful period overlapped exactly with Suspense's peak years. The show ran for 20 years and produced nearly 1,000 episodes. CBS archived a significant portion of them because the network understood it was producing something that would last. Hundreds of Suspense episodes survive in excellent condition and are available today. What Suspense left behind was the framework for the psychological thriller, the dramatic irony, the slow build, the audience positioned as a helpless witness. Every thriller screenplay written in the last 70 years has been shaped by the grammar that Suspense established in those CBS studios during the Second World War. Number 18, The Great Gildersleeve. The Great Gildersleeve began in 1941 as a spin-off from Fibber, McGee, and Molly, making it the first successful spin-off in the history of American radio. Throckmorton P. Gildersleeve, a pompous water commissioner in the fictional town of Summerfield, had appeared on Fibber, McGee as a supporting character and had become so popular that NBC gave him his own program. Hal Peary played Gildersleeve for the first 8 years with a booming pomposity that made the character the funniest blowhard in American radio. He was not evil. He was simply very sure of himself in situations where confidence was not warranted. He was guardian to his orphaned niece and nephew, and the show's warmth came from watching a man who had never been responsible for anything slowly and imperfectly learn to be responsible for children. Americans loved The Great Gildersleeve because it was about the experience of realizing later in life than you expected that other people matter more than you thought they did. That is not a funny premise in the abstract. But Perry made it funny by refusing to let Gildersleeve become a better man too quickly or too completely. He would learn a lesson and then partially forget it by the following week. Progress was real but modest. That is also how it works in life. The show ran until 1958. In its later years, the character's pomposity had softened enough that the comedy came from warmth rather than embarrassment. Whether that made it a better show or a less funny one is a question that Radio Row debated for years. What The Great Gildersleeve left behind was the spin-off as a legitimate form. Every television series that has launched a secondary character into their own program owes its structural justification to Throckmorton P. Gildersleeve's successful graduation from supporting player to leading man in 1941. Number 17, Our Miss Brooke. Our Miss Brooks ran from 1948 to 1957 and starred Eve Arden as Connie Brooks, a high school English teacher in the fictional town of Madison who was sharp, quick-witted, perpetually broke, perpetually in love with the biology teacher Mr. Boynton, who perpetually failed to notice, and perpetually battling her pompous principal, Mr. Conklin. Eve. Arden's performance was the finest comic acting in American radio. She delivered lines at a speed and with a precision that made every other actor around her seem slightly slow. Her timing was so exact that the writers began writing specifically for her rhythm. Jokes that would have been adequate with another performer became something else entirely when Arden said them. Americans loved our Miss Brooks because Connie Brooks was the first genuinely modern woman in American broadcast comedy. She was not defined by her relationship to a man. She had a job she was good at. She had opinions. She had financial problems that were her own and not inherited from a husband. She was funny because she was intelligent, not despite it. That was unusual in 1948. It is less unusual now, partly because Connie Brooks existed and people could see what it looked like. The show moved to television in 1952 while continuing on radio until 1957. The television version won Eve Arden an Emmy Award. The radio version is remembered by the people who heard it as something more intimate and more precisely funny than the television version ever quite managed to be. What our Miss Brooks left behind was the working woman as a viable center of a comedy. The specific combination of professional competence, romantic frustration, and economic precarity that has powered every workplace comedy aimed at women in the 70 years since Connie Brooks first walked into Madison High School. Number 16, The Jack Armstrong Show. Jack Armstrong, the all-American boy, ran from 1933 to 1951 and was aimed specifically at children between the ages of 8 and 14. Jack Armstrong was a student at Hudson High School who somehow managed to have adventures on every continent while apparently attending classes regularly. He fought smugglers in the Philippines. He tracked criminals in the American Southwest. He uncovered espionage rings during the Second World War. He did all of this with his friends Billy and Betty Fairfield and their Uncle Jim. The show was built around a specific philosophy of American boyhood. Jack Armstrong was honest and brave, physically fit and respectful of adults. He did not lie. He did not cheat. When he was in danger, which was constantly, he thought his way out of it rather than simply fighting. He was an aspirational figure, not a fantasy, a boy who was better than most boys, but not impossibly better. Americans loved the Jack Armstrong show because in the 1930s and the 1940s, parents trusted commercial radio to help them teach their children who to be. The show's values were the values that parents in small-town and rural America held and wanted their children to hold. Courage, honesty, loyalty, the willingness to help someone weaker than yourself. These were not complicated values. They were presented simply and consistently over 18 years of afternoon broadcasts. The show ended in 1951, retitled Armstrong of the SBI, an attempt to update the concept for the post-war audience that had stopped believing in the uncomplicated heroism of the all-American boy. The update lasted 1 year before the program was canceled. Sometimes a character cannot survive the end of the era that created him. What Jack Armstrong left behind was the after-school adventure serial, the format of the young protagonist who faces genuine danger and genuine moral choices and comes through because of character rather than luck. Every young adult adventure narrative that has followed owes something to Jack and his friends who left Hudson High School every afternoon for 18 years and always came home safely. Number 15, One Man's Family. One Man's Family ran from 1932 to 1959 on NBC and is the longest-running dramatic serial in American radio history, 27 years. The story of the Barber family of Seacliff, California follows the patriarch Henry Barber, his wife Fanny, and their 5 children as they age in real time through the Depression, the Second World War, the post-war prosperity, and into the Eisenhower era. The creator, Carlton E. Morse, wrote virtually every episode himself. He understood that the power of a generational story was specificity. The Barbers were not representative of all American families. They were this family with these particular arguments and these particular loyalties and these particular ways of showing love that were slightly different from anyone else's ways. The universality came from the specificity, not despite it. Americans loved One Man's Family because it treated the domestic life of an ordinary family as worthy of serious attention. Nothing that happened to the Barbers was extraordinary. They fell in love. They married people their parents did not entirely approve of. They had children. They lost money and made it back. They disagreed about politics and religion and how to raise grandchildren. Carlton E. Morse treated all of this as genuinely interesting, and his audience agreed with him for 27 years. The show ended in 1959 with Henry Barber still in his Seacliff house, still arguing with his children, still the head of a family that had spent a quarter of a century growing and changing and surviving. The last episode was heard by an audience much smaller than the one that had greeted the first. The country had changed. The Barbers had changed with it. What One Man's Family left behind was the multi-generational family drama, the idea that you could follow a family across decades and that the audience would follow with them. Every soap opera that has run for 20-plus years on American television is working in the form that Carlton E. Morse established in 1932. Number 14, Dimension X. Dimension X ran for only 50 episodes between 1950 and 1951, which makes it the most influential short-lived program in American radio history. It was the first serious science fiction anthology on American radio, adapting stories by Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Robert Heinlein, and Kurt Vonnegut for a broadcast audience that had never encountered these writers before. The production values were exceptional. The sound design created worlds that had never existed and made them feel plausible through the careful layering of tone, texture, and silence. A story about a man stranded on Mars in 1950 sounded like Mars because the producers understood that what you do not hear is as important as what you do. Americans who encountered Dimension X in 1950 and 1951 were hearing ideas about the future that the rest of popular culture would not catch up with for another decade. The moral complexity of Asimov's robots, the bittersweet nostalgia of Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, the political satire buried in Vonnegut's early stories. These were serious ideas presented in a broadcast format that most people associated with detective shows and family comedies. The show was canceled after 50 episodes because NBC could not sell enough advertising to justify the production cost. Advertisers in 1951 did not believe that science fiction attracted a buying audience. They were wrong, but they did not find out they were wrong until it was too late for Dimension X. What Dimension X left behind was the science fiction anthology format and the proof that broadcast audiences would engage with serious speculative fiction. Every science fiction anthology television program, every audio drama series, every podcast that takes speculative ideas seriously as storytelling material is building on the foundation that 50 episodes of Dimension X established in a single year. Number 13, Burns and Allen. George Burns and Gracie Allen began on radio in 1929 and ran until 1950, when the program moved to television. For 21 years, George Burns was the straight man to what was arguably the most sophisticated comic performance in American broadcast history. Gracie Allen played a character of profound, apparent illogic who was in fact operating according to a completely consistent internal logic that simply ran perpendicular to the logic everyone else used. She was not stupid. She was operating from different premises and arriving at conclusions that were perfectly valid given those premises. George Burns understood this and built his entire performance around it. His job was to occupy the space where normal logic lived so that Gracie's perpendicular logic could bounce off him and become funny. Americans loved Burns and Allen because Gracie made the world seem slightly different than it was. She heard ordinary sentences and found meanings in them that were not intended, and yet were grammatically defensible. She approached situations with a confidence that never wavered, because she never doubted her own premises. In a decade of economic depression and a world war, a woman who approached everything with unshakable confidence based on premises that made sense to her was not just funny. She was also slightly comforting. Gracie Allen retired from performing in 1958 and died in 1964. George Burns never quite found another character to play after her. He tried several formats and none of them worked as well. He was 93 years old when he finally found another part that suited him, playing God in a movie. He played it as though God was a man who had watched everything that had ever happened and found it gently amusing. That is also how George Burns had played straight man to Gracie Allen for 35 years. What Burns and Allen left behind was the double act in which the comedian is also the center of gravity. Every comic duo in which one partner plays the bewildered straight man and the other plays a character operating from alien premises owes a debt to George and Gracie. So does every piece of comedy writing in which the joke is not what someone says, but the gap between what they mean and what they understand. Number 12, Kraft Music Hall. Kraft Music Hall ran from 1933 to 1949 and for most of that run was hosted by Bing Crosby, making it one of the most listened-to variety programs in American radio history. Crosby hosted from 1936 to 1946 and transformed the format from a conventional radio variety show into something closer to the thing you felt when you heard Bing Crosby's voice. That voice. It is worth stopping for a moment to consider what Bing Crosby's voice meant to Americans in the late 1930s and the early 1940s. The crooner style he had developed was entirely new. He held the microphone close and sang quietly as though he were singing only for you, in a room where it was just the two of you. Radio made this intimacy possible at a scale that was not possible before. 40 million people could each feel that Bing Crosby was singing specifically for them. The show's format was a conversation. Crosby chatted with his guests, joked with the orchestra, and took his time. He refused to be in a hurry. That unhurried quality was a deliberate choice in an era when every other variety show was rushed and loud. Crosby understood that quiet was a kind of authority. Kraft Music Hall ended in 1949 when Crosby's contract with NBC expired and he moved to ABC. The show that replaced him was never quite the same thing. You cannot replace a voice like that with a format. What Kraft Music Hall left behind was the template for the hosted variety show built around a performer's personality rather than a schedule of acts. Every late-night program in American television history that has been built around one host's specific voice and sensibility owes its structural DNA to the show that Bing Crosby made by refusing to be in a hurry. Number 11, The Green Hornet. The Green Hornet began in 1936 on a Detroit station, the same station that had launched the Lone Ranger 3 years earlier, and with the same creator, George Trendle. The Green Hornet was Britt Reed, a newspaper publisher who fought crime at night as a masked vigilante, accompanied by his valet Cato, riding in a car called Black Beauty, and using a gas gun that incapacitated rather than killed. The show's structural conceit was that the Green Hornet was believed by the police and the public to be a criminal. He appeared at crime scenes and disappeared before anyone could determine whose side he was on. He was an outlaw who fought crime by operating outside the law. That ambiguity was more sophisticated than most radio adventure programs attempted. Americans loved the Green Hornet because it asked a question that the Lone Ranger did not ask. What if the hero had to operate in the gray area? What if the legal system was too slow or too corrupt to handle the crime, and someone had to act outside it? The Lone Ranger's world had a clear moral order. The Green Hornet's world was murkier, and its hero's position within that world was never entirely comfortable. The program ran until 1952. The recordings were poorly preserved, and many early episodes are lost. What survives is enough to understand why the character has been revived repeatedly across every medium that has come along since. The ambiguous hero operating at the edge of legality speaks to something permanent in the American imagination. What the Green Hornet left behind was the anti-hero as a viable protagonist for mainstream American entertainment. The hero who cannot be thanked by the people he saves because they think he is one of the criminals. Every morally complex protagonist in American popular fiction is working in the territory that Britt Reed mapped from that Detroit studio in 1936. Number 10, You Bet Your Life. You Bet Your Life was nominally a quiz show. It ran from 1947 to 1961, and it was hosted by Groucho Marx. In practice, the quiz portion was minimal and the prizes were modest, so contestants often seemed surprised when the game part of the program actually arrived. What the show really was a conversation between Groucho Marx and ordinary Americans who had no idea what they were getting into. Groucho talked to school teachers from Ohio, farmers from Georgia, and retired sailors from New England. He asked them about their lives, and then he said things about those answers that the contestants never quite expected. The studio audience laughed, and the contestants laughed too, slightly delayed, as they caught up with what had just happened. Americans loved You Bet Your Life because Groucho treated ordinary people as though they were interesting, and then proved that they were. His attention was absolute. He listened, and when he responded to what people had actually said rather than what he expected them to say. That is rarer than it sounds. The show ran for 14 years. Groucho Marx was 65 years old when it finally ended, and he had been performing for 50 years. You Bet Your Life was the only thing he ever did that revealed what he was actually like when he was listening instead of performing. What You Bet Your Life left behind was the talk show as a serious form, the hosted conversation with ordinary people in which the host's intelligence is used to illuminate rather than embarrass. Every interview format that uses genuine listening rather than prepared questions owes something to what Groucho Marx was doing in that radio studio every week for 14 years. Number 9, the Aldrich family. The Aldrich family ran from 1939 to 1953 and began every episode with the same exchange. His mother called his name Henry. Henry Aldrich was always on the verge of getting into trouble, always surprised that trouble had found him again. His voice cracked in answer. "Coming, Mother!" Henry Aldrich was the avatar of the American teenage boy in the 1940s. He was not a juvenile delinquent. He was not a misunderstood rebel. He was a specific kind of ordinary adolescent who made reasonable decisions in situations where reasonable decisions consistently led to unreasonable outcomes. He was earnest and slightly hapless, and loved by an audience of parents who recognized their own children in him, and by children who recognized themselves. Americans loved the Aldrich family because it looked at adolescence with affection rather than alarm. The 1940s was a decade in which a great deal of American culture treated teenagers as a problem to be managed. The Aldrich family treated them as a comic situation to be appreciated. The comedy was not mean. Henry Aldrich was never humiliated. He was consistently in over his head and consistently, just barely, got out. The show ended in 1953 as its original teenage audience aged into adults, and the new teenage audience had moved to music and film. Henry Aldrich belonged to a specific post-war American adolescence that television was already replacing with something louder and faster. What the Aldrich family left behind was the sympathetic portrait of the American teenager as a legitimate subject for comedy. Every coming-of-age comedy that has treated adolescence as fundamentally funny rather than fundamentally threatening owes something to the crack in Henry Aldrich's voice when his mother called his name. Number 8, The Fred Allen Show. Fred Allen is remembered today by everyone who knows about him as the funniest man in American radio, and by almost no one else. He ran his own program from 1932 to 1949 with a wit that was so dense and so fast, and so specifically aimed at the hypocrisies and pretensions of American commercial culture that his audience had to be paying very close attention to keep up. He feuded famously with Jack Benny in a running radio comedy bit that lasted years and drew enormous audiences. The feud was entirely manufactured, and both men were friends. But the performances they gave within that manufactured feud were some of the best comic work produced in the medium. What Fred Allen actually cared about was the state of American culture and what commercial entertainment was doing to it. He was suspicious of television before it arrived, and said so loudly. He predicted that the medium would reward visual novelty over intelligence. He was entirely correct. When his own program moved to television in 1950, it lasted 1 season. He never found his footing in a medium that could not accommodate the speed at which his mind worked. Americans loved Fred Allen's radio program because it assumed they were smart enough to follow a mind that moved faster than most broadcast entertainment. That assumption was unusual and flattering. The audience responded to being flattered in that particular way. Fred Allen died in 1956 of a heart attack while walking in New York. He was 61 years old. He left behind a radio legacy that virtually no one under 50 has ever heard, and a reputation among comedy writers as the writer's comedian. The people who make things that other people laugh at consider Fred Allen the best who ever did it on the radio. What Fred Allen left behind was the tradition of the comedian who is also a social critic, the performer who treats the entertainment industry itself as a legitimate target. Every satirist who has worked in American broadcasting is working in Fred Allen's shadow, whether they know it or not. Number 7, the Lux Radio Theater. The Lux Radio Theater ran from 1934 to 1955 and presented hour-long adaptations of major Hollywood films with the original stars whenever possible: Clark Gable, Barbara Stanwyck, Jimmy Stewart, Bette Davis, Humphrey Bogart, and Cary Grant came to the Lux Radio Theater and performed condensed versions of their most famous films for radio audiences who had seen those films in theaters and wanted to hear them again in a different form. Cecil B. DeMille hosted the program from 1936 to 1945, and he brought to it the sense of occasion that only a man who genuinely believed he was making history could project. He interviewed the stars before and after each performance, as though they were appearing before him to report on what had happened. The stars submitted to this with varying degrees of patience. Americans loved the Lux Radio Theater because it was glamour in the living room. Hollywood had always been elsewhere. The Lux Radio Theater brought it close enough to touch. The actors sounded like themselves. You could hear them breathe. When Barbara Stanwyck performed in a Lux Radio Theater adaptation of Double Indemnity, she was in a studio in Hollywood, and you were in your kitchen in rural Ohio. But the distance between you felt smaller than it had ever been before. The program ended in 1955 as television made the original films available in a form that radio could not compete with. You could not argue with moving pictures when the alternative was voices. What the Lux Radio Theater left behind was the concept of celebrity as a genuine entertainment product, separate from any particular film or performance. The idea that people wanted to hear what famous people sounded like when they talked, that the famous person was interesting in themselves beyond the work they did. Every celebrity interview format in American media history begins with Cecil B. DeMille asking Barbara Stanwyck how it felt to perform Double Indemnity on the radio. Number 6, Lights Out. Lights Out ran from 1934 to 1947 and was created and written for most of its run by Arch Oboler, who was either a genius or deeply disturbed, and probably both. The show aired at midnight on NBC. Before the first episode, the announcer advised listeners to turn off their lights and sit in complete darkness while listening. Arch Oboler wrote stories about people who turned into chickens, about a man whose hands had a life of their own, and about creatures that came through dimensions no one had previously considered. He treated the rules of physical reality as suggestions, and he wrote stories in which those suggestions were frequently ignored, with fatal results for the people involved. The horror was not supernatural in a conventional sense. It was physical. Bodies did things that bodies were not supposed to do, and matter misbehaved. The sound design was built to make listeners feel the wrongness in their own skin. Oboler understood that the most disturbing horror is not what you cannot imagine, but what you can imagine too clearly. Americans listened to Lights Out at midnight in darkened rooms and then did not sleep very well. That was the desired outcome. Oboler considered frightening people a serious artistic achievement, and he pursued it with the commitment of a craftsman who genuinely cared about the quality of the fright he was delivering. The show ended in 1947. Several of the most famous episodes were adapted for television in the early 1950s, but the television versions were less frightening than the radio originals because you could see what was happening. Half of what Lights Out did was done by what you could not see. What Lights Out left behind was the body horror tradition in American entertainment. It is the story that disturbs not because of what it shows you, but because of what it makes you feel in your own physical existence. Every horror narrative that relies on the wrongness of the body rather than the presence of a monster owes a debt to Arch Oboler sitting in a studio at midnight making people's skin crawl. Number 5, M.A. Perkins. Ma Perkins ran from 1933 to 1960 and holds the record for the longest-running daytime serial in American radio history. It ran for 27 years. She was a widow who ran a lumber yard in the fictional small-town Rushville Center. She had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. The audience loved her for it unconditionally. Virginia Payne played Ma Perkins for all 27 years. She was 24 years old when she first took the role, and she was 51 when the show ended. She had played a 60-year-old woman for 27 years, and she had grown into the part so completely that when Oxydol, the sponsor, announced the cancellation, the audience response was the largest protest mail in the history of American broadcasting up to that point. Americans loved Ma Perkins because she had a specific kind of wisdom, the kind people develop after surviving difficulty. Not philosophical wisdom, but practical wisdom. She knew what people needed. She knew how to be honest without being cruel. She knew that most problems, if you waited long enough, would either solve themselves or become problems you could live with. The show ended in 1960 when television soap operas had successfully migrated the daytime serial audience to a visual medium. The last episode aired on November 25, 1960. Virginia Payne delivered the final lines, and the show signed off after more than 7,000 episodes. What Ma Perkins left behind was the model for the wise elder at the center of a long-running serial drama. The character who does not drive the plot, but who holds the moral weight of the narrative. Every soap opera matriarch who has ever dispensed wisdom while managing a family crisis is working in the tradition that Virginia Payne inhabited for 27 years in a radio studio. Number 4, Let's Pretend. Let's Pretend ran from 1930 to 1954 and was the finest children's radio program in American history. Every Saturday morning, a cast of children performed classic fairy tales and original fantasy stories for an audience of children listening on kitchen radios and parlor sets across the country. The show's philosophy was simple. Children could handle complexity. Children could handle genuine danger in a story as long as the story had a genuine resolution. Children did not need to be protected from the dark parts of fairy tales. They needed good versions of fairy tales that honored the darkness and the light in equal measure. Neela Mack produced and directed Let's Pretend for most of its run, and cast real children in every role, training them with a precision that produced performances of startling quality. A 10-year-old boy playing a king in a fairy tale on Let's Pretend sounded like a king because Neela Mack did not accept less. Americans loved Let's Pretend because their children loved it and because it was genuinely good. That combination is rarer than it sounds. Most children's programming in any medium is tolerated by parents rather than enjoyed. Let's Pretend was enjoyed by everyone in the room. The show ended in 1954 as its audience moved to Saturday morning television. The last episode aired, and Neela Mack died the following year in 1955. She had spent 25 years teaching children how to inhabit imaginary worlds through voice alone. What Let's Pretend left behind was the standard for children's audio storytelling. The idea that children deserve the best writers, the best directors, and the most rigorous production values that anyone was willing to bring to any broadcast. Every audio program for children that takes its audience seriously is working in the tradition that Neela Mack established every Saturday morning for 25 years. Number 3, The Bob Hope Show. Bob Hope's radio program ran from 1938 to 1955 and was, for much of that period, the most listened to broadcast in American radio. Hope had developed a specific style of comedy that was unlike anything else on radio. He worked from a monologue rather than from characters. He stood alone at the microphone and said things that were funny one after another, at a speed and with a timing that made other comedians seem like they were moving through water. The topical joke was Hope's particular genius. He wrote about what was happening in the news that week. If you were not following the news, some of the jokes would not land for you, and that was your problem. He did not slow down for the audience that was not paying attention. The audience that was paying attention received comedy that felt like it had been written specifically for this moment in history and could not have been written 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later. Americans loved Bob Hope's radio program because it made them feel that the person talking to them was fully present in the same historical moment they were living in. During the Second World War, Hope did his program from military bases and hospitals, performing for the men who were fighting. The connection between comedian and audience in those broadcasts was not metaphorical. They were in the same room, in the same war, and the comedy made the room smaller and the war slightly more bearable. The radio program ended in 1955 as Hope's television program became his primary platform. He continued performing on television, in films, and on USO tours until he was in his 90s. What Bob Hope's radio program left behind was the topical comedian as a central figure in American public life. It created the performer who shows up in the middle of events rather than commenting on them from a safe distance. Every comedian who performs in zones of conflict or at moments of national stress is working in a tradition that Bob Hope built during the Second World War. Number 2, the Mercury Theater on the Air. The Mercury Theater on the Air ran for 13 episodes in 1938 before it was picked up by Campbell's Soup and renamed. Orson Welles was 23 years old. He had assembled a company of the most talented actors in New York theater, and he was given Sunday nights on CBS to do whatever he wanted with them. On October 30th, 1938, he adapted the novel War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells as a fake news broadcast. A dance program was interrupted by reports of Martian landings in New Jersey, The reports were delivered with the precision of actual news broadcasts. Reporters were interviewed, experts were consulted. People believed it. The national panic has been somewhat overstated by history. Most listeners heard the opening announcement that it was a dramatic program, but a significant number did not hear the opening announcement and did believe, at least for a few minutes, that something extraordinary was happening. The program revealed something important about the relationship between broadcast authority and public trust that media theorists are still writing about. Americans who experienced the Mercury Theater on the air in those 13 episodes heard the most adventurous broadcasting in the history of the medium. Wells staged Conrad, Shakespeare, and Dumas for radio with an inventiveness that transformed what radio drama could be. The War of the Worlds was not an aberration. It was the logical conclusion of what Wells had been doing all summer. What the Mercury Theater on the air left behind was proof that the broadcast medium could do something that print and film could not do. It could make you believe something was happening in real time when it was not happening at all. Every media experiment that has played with the boundary between journalism and fiction, between reality and performance, owes a debt to a 23-year-old with 13 Sunday nights and complete creative freedom. Number 1, The Cavalcade of America. The Cavalcade of America ran from 1935 to 1953 and was sponsored by the DuPont Corporation. Each episode dramatized a moment in American history, focusing on the stories of ordinary Americans who had done something that mattered. Inventors, farmers, teachers, soldiers, people who had built things or saved things or simply refused to give up when giving up would have been easier. The show was produced with a level of historical care that was unusual for sponsored radio. DuPont had commissioned a program meant to make Americans feel good about American history, but the writers and producers understood that the best version of that assignment meant telling true stories about real people as accurately as the dramatic form allowed. Norman Corwin, widely regarded as the greatest writer in American radio history, wrote some of his finest work for the Cavalcade of America. His episodes are still read in schools that teach broadcast writing. His command of the specific emotional register that American history requires, the combination of pride and grief, and the acknowledgement that what was built cost something, has never been matched in the medium. Americans loved the Cavalcade of America because it told them the story of who they were through the stories of specific people who had lived those stories, not abstract principles, not famous names, people who had been almost forgotten and were now remembered for 30 minutes on a Sunday evening. The show ended in 1953 as television drew audiences away from historical drama on radio. The recordings survive in better condition than most programs of the era because DuPont maintained its archives carefully. What the Cavalcade of America left behind was the documentary drama as a legitimate form of popular entertainment. The true story told with the craft of fiction while respecting the truth of what happened. Every historical drama in any medium that takes both history and drama seriously is working in the tradition that Norman Corwin and the Cavalcade of America established in those 30 minutes of Sunday radio between 1935 and 1953. 25 programs, 25 rooms that millions of Americans walked into every week and sat down in and listened. The rooms are all closed now, but the sounds that were made inside them shaped everything that came after. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and watch the next video above.